So this is why we're looking very carefully at your historical and emotional selves. These are the main components of this self that you feel is arriving from the past. Until you stop identifying with this self as who you are, you can't get any farther in Zen. So far, we've pointed out that your historical self is a projection, a fiction that you've created, one that comes complete with its own environment, a spatialized past that it has traveled through on its way to the present. We've seen how this is completely a mental creation. It's nothing more than mental activity occurring in the present. So not only is it not real and not who you are, it's not really even arriving from the past. The emotional self is not such an easy nut to crack. It's different from your historical self. It's not a two-legged figure that you visualize moving through time. Your emotional self seems to be cumulative. It feels like it's made up of all the wounds you've ever suffered, your victories, losses, loves, sorrows, all your attempts year after year to cross the gap. It feels like it's all accreted year after year inside of you. Surely, this is who you are. Clearly, this self is arriving from the past. If we go looking inside ourselves for our emotional self, what we find is a box full of torn, well-handled snapshots that we have of ourselves at various points in our lives, in a certain relationship with a certain person, or in an apartment we've lived in the time just after our divorce, or in the time following the death of someone we loved. When we look at these snapshots, they have a foreground and a background. In the foreground is the event or the time itself, who you were with, or where you were, and how it all felt. In the background is a sort of a glow that surrounds the image, warmer during the happy times, and darker during the not-so-happy times. In other words, each of these emotional snapshots has a context of how that time was in your life, and that's why these snapshots have survived. If we look more closely, we find that the glow surrounding each snapshot has to do with our trial within. All your life, there's been a gap between you and the world, between self and not-self. At each of these events in your life, in each of the snapshots that make up your emotional self, you were either successfully bridging that gap or failing to bridge the gap. So, if you were always afraid to talk to your father as a child, you were unsuccessful at joining the world. You failed at crossing the gap. There is a darkness around those snapshots. When you graduated with full honors from college and life seemed like a shimmering cloud, the gap between you and world was crossed. You were successful. The snapshot shimmers as well. 15 years later, when you were unable to save your marriage, the gap was a chasm. You were alone. The snapshot is torn and dark. For some of us, most of our early snapshots are happy ones. We had no real problems feeling ourselves part of the world growing up. The best times of our lives were high school and college. It was only later in life that we had darker struggles and darker snapshots. For others, our teenage and early adult years are full of darker snapshots. We were constantly unable to bridge the gap between ourselves and world. It was only much later in life, after tremendous struggle, that we were able to build this bridge. And it is these snapshots, much later in life, that are finally warm. The real emotional context for all the events in our lives is how well we are managing to cross the gap. Are we successful in drawing others closer? Are we gaining the validation and confirmation that only the not-self can provide? Are we managing to rejoin the not-self? Our trial within has been in session all our lives. The trial is about whether we deserve to be here, whether or not we are worthy. Everything that happens in the outside world, especially our success and failures at crossing the gap, gets presented as evidence. When the evidence is in our favor, our lives are good, and the snapshots that we have from these times have a warm glow. When the evidence is against us, our days are dark. We were not successful at closing the gap, so the snapshots we retain from those times have a different glow. All these snapshots of yourself, of how each situation in your life has gone, your victories and defeats, how you were and how you could have been or should have been, have all added up year after year into this emotional self that you now feel you are. So this emotional self is not a Cartesian representation that travels through space and time. It is the inner cumulative result of the existential struggle that you've been in all your life, your attempts to cross the gap and rejoin the not-self.